So I'd like to thank the organizers for putting together a great symposium, and sorry, I don't know. It doesn't have anything. It's okay. Putting together a great symposium and inviting me here to talk a little bit today about the kind of some background material on rabies. I do, before we get started, just want to take a quick note and a comment about the title. I'm guessing that there aren't many Shakespearean scholars in the audience. We've probably drawn the One Health circle a little large if we're getting into that group. But Shakespeare had a very distinct perspective on what that few poison is that's more deadly than a mad dog's tooth. And I'll just leave it there, and maybe bonus points later on today if we can have that discussion. But saying that, and knowing now that there's at least a portion of you that are using your smartphones to look up Shakespearean quotes, I'd like to start by dispelling some of the myths that are out there about rabies. And first and foremost, we commonly think of rabies as a rare disease, especially in the United States. And in fact, this is not true. We know that globally there are more than 55 to 60,000 cases of human rabies, and that's a human death about every 10 minutes. This isn't something that's rare that's occurring. Rabies is certainly widespread. It's largely distributed throughout the United States and globally. And in fact, many of the countries that consider themselves to be rabies-free, in fact, do still have rabies. There's often a concept that we can't control wildlife diseases. And again, I think rabies is a case in that model that wildlife diseases can in fact be controlled and potentially even eliminated in certain perspectives. And I think more than anything today, if you take home this fact, that possums can in fact get rabies. We can go ahead and rule that out. There's not a lot of brain material there to work with, but they do get it, and we have possum rabies reported on a regular basis. So I want to spend a little bit of time just to quickly cover rabies. I'll talk a little bit about the virus and the syndrome, a quick review of global rabies, and then kind of move into a more direct perspective of rabies in the United States. So when we talk about rabies, I'm sure everyone's aware, we're talking about an acute progressive viral encephalitis. It has one of the highest case fatality ratios of any infectious disease, and it's one of the leading viral zoonoses, and from a One Health perspective is typically the sort of case example given for One Health medicine in action. It is distributed on all continents, with the exception of Antarctica, obviously. And it's one of the oldest infectious disease with comments and reports going back more than 4,000 years in the literature. When we talk about rabies, it's important to make the distinction that rabies is the disease. It's caused by a RNA virus of the family Rhabdovirus and the genus Lyssavirus. So rabies virus is the type species that we're most commonly familiar with in the United States as the only Lyssavirus in the United States. But there are more than 6 other Lyssaviruses that cause the disease rabies. And in fact, actually, there were recently, the ICTV approved another recognized that another 4 Lyssaviruses spread throughout Eurasia. And actually, there are on top of that another 3 that have recently been discovered. And these aren't diseases that are necessarily from a pathogen discovery perspective that are discovered in the deep, dark corners of Africa. One of the most recent was discovered in the attic of an elderly woman in Germany. So even where we consider these things, that we won't find these sort of rare and new diseases, we do find Lyssaviruses. And this is important not just from the perspective of pathogen discovery to find new things, but from a public health perspective. Several of these Lyssaviruses have now been recognized as not being, as the current biologics and vaccines are not protective against these viruses. So in fact, there are some Lyssaviruses that cause the disease, prevalent largely throughout Africa, that if you're exposed to these diseases, there's literally no repercussion, management, or treatment that we can, that modern medicine can carry out. All mammals are susceptible. That being said, the major reservoirs for sustaining the virus are primarily distributed throughout the orders of Carnivora and Chiroptera, or bats. When we think about the dynamics of virus transmission in rabies, it's, again, largely maintained in nature through specific species that act as the reservoir for the virus, and most of the transmission is between members of the same species. On very rare occasions, we can have potential host shift events in which this virus has a cross-species transmission and moves and is maintained in a new species. But for the most part, these recognized variants of the virus are dead-end transmission and may only have 1 or 2 more cycles of transmission outside of that species. Once rabies virus Once a person has been exposed and transmission has occurred, and this occurs primarily via the bite route we commonly think of for rabies transmission, but can also occur when infectious material either enters another wound, or break in the skin, or mucosa tissue. At that point, the virus, which is extremely neurotropic, enters the peripheral nerves and then moves centripetally towards the CNS, where it replicates in the CNS. At that point, after replication has occurred, and this is typically around the time that signs and symptoms begin to develop, the virus is then moving back out to innervated organs, most notably into the salivary glands, where it then moves for transmission to other animals. So again, the viral excretion is primarily via the saliva. So this is the route of transmission that we're most concerned about. The unique thing of rabies, and the fortunate thing of rabies, is that we don't have to be worried about other infectious material that we commonly think of with diseases through blood, urine, feces, and other potential exposures. Once a person has been exposed to the virus, the progression typically begins starting with the incubation period. The average incubation period that we see in animals and humans is typically in the 6 to 12 week range, but there are rarer cases of prolonged, long duration incubation periods in rabies. And in fact, well, here we have 2 years. We just recently published a report of a incubation period in excess of 8 years in a person with relatively high evidence to suggest that incubation period was that length. Once the virus has started to move towards the CNS, there enters a prodromal stage in which we have the general nonspecific signs, fever, flu-like symptoms. But then this quickly develops into an acute neurological phase, and this is the classical symptoms that we think of. There may be paresthesias moving along the nerve tracts from where the exposure occurred. Moving into acute signs of encephalitis. In animals, this can be aggression, or humans for that matter, can be aggression or paralytic type presentations. But the key thing about rabies is that this progressively worsens into coma and ultimately death. And while we've certainly had some rare cases of survival in rabies involving experimental treatment protocols, that is generally the exception to the rule. And there still is not any recognized treatment protocol for a person, successful treatment protocol for a person once signs of the disease have developed. When we consider diagnosis of rabies virus, and this is certainly from a perspective of animals submitted for diagnosis, something that recurs on a routine basis every day in the United States, the gold standard is still the euthanasia and collection of brain material, and then detection of viral antigens in the CNS via direct fluorescent antibody staining methodology. This goes across several laboratories. There are routes of antemortem diagnosis, primarily reserved for humans with suspicion of rabies. But this is a very involved test involving 4 samples, viral detection in both serum and CSF, detection of rabies virus nucleic acids and the saliva, and skin biopsy, and as well as sectioning of a skin biopsy to determine if viral antigen is present. And it's really only throughout all of this testing and a case of not finding any evidence of rabies virus across all of these samples that we can make a certain rule out that rabies is not present in a patient. And this is largely because at any given time during the progression of the disease, there may not be evidence of antibody detection. The virus is excreted intermittently in the saliva, and there are other difficulties in trying to make an assessment off of a single diagnostic specimen. So when we think about rabies prevention, our primary routes of prevention are kind of those basic common sense concepts. Avoid exposure, don't put your arm in the coyote's mouth. Vaccinating your domestic animals, and this is still a tried and true method for preventing rabies, particularly exposure to humans in the United States. Even though we've eliminated the canine rabies virus variant, your domestic animals, cats and dogs, are still the primary barrier between you and rabies circulating in wildlife animals, since they have a much higher rate of potential exposure and passing that rabies exposure on to you. And sort of moving on to the next stage of that is actually moving out into the wildlife population itself and looking at trying to control rabies in those populations through oral rabies vaccination. I'll speak a little bit about that later on. Our next step is really then moving into direct either pre or post-exposure prophylaxis in the human population. Pre-exposure prophylaxis is primarily intended for people with either an occupational or recreational risk of contact with rabies compared to the general population. And while pre-exposure prophylaxis doesn't eliminate the need for post-exposure, it does greatly simplify the management of patients and when and if exposure occurs in the future. The series consists of 3 vaccines given on day 0, 7, and 21 or 28. For general population, there's no need for any serology post-vaccination to confirm to confirm that you've been immunized. But for certain populations, say persons working in rabies virus laboratory, when laboratories working with rabies virus, or for veterinarians working in rabies enzootic areas, there are recommendations to receive routine routine serology. And I'll check, I didn't see earlier, how many veterinary students do we have in the crowd? Any at all?
They have class.
Okay, they had class. In general, one of the most common questions, one of the more common questions that we get at CDC is from the veterinarian who's received an exposure, was vaccinated 25 years ago, never received a serum titer in the intervention, and wants to know if they're okay and go forward. And it makes our lives a little bit of a headache. I was going to yell at them. So if in the event that there is ever an exposure in the future, there is still a need for a booster of 2 doses of vaccine on day 0 and 3. When we consider post-exposure prophylaxis and the administration after a potential rabies exposure has occurred, while certainly we have better biologics and we have shorter schedules, this is still basically the same concept that Pasteur had in the 1880s, in a race in trying to get the body to develop immunogenicity before the virus can replicate and move into the CNS. PEP consists of primarily first wound care. We know that just the simple act of washing a wound after an exposure has occurred can reduce the risk of rabies developing. And followed by administration of, in the United States, a human rabies immune globulin based on body weight, and then a series of 4 doses of vaccine on over 2 weeks, 0, 7, 0, 3, 7, and 14. And there's been a lot of progress over the years, moving forward. I'm sure a lot of people have that memory of the old 28 shots in the stomach. We've come a long way. It's just a couple of shots in the arm, though certainly the administration of immune globulin isn't a pleasant experience. But in general, if this is administered promptly and properly, the survival is virtually assured after a potential exposure has occurred. The other thing to keep in mind is that post-exposure prophylaxis is a medical urgency. It's not an emergency. We would like to stress this because there is time after an exposure has occurred in order to try and obtain the animal, if it's a cat, dog, or ferret, for observation. If the animal is healthy over a 10-day period, that can preclude the need for post-exposure prophylaxis. Or alternatively, if it's wildlife, or the animal is displaying signs, to immediately euthanize the animal and test it for rabies. And again, this is one of the unique features of rabies from a One Health perspective, is that it's one of the only diseases where diagnosis of a disease in an animal has a direct repercussion on the management and administration of treatment to a human. So this is, sorry. I got caught in an animation. So this is kind of largely the perspective of what we're trying to achieve with post-exposure prophylaxis. We have an early time period at the start in which virus is trying to enter the peripheral nerve, and replication is occurring locally, in which the human rabies immune globulin is administered at that site to try and neutralize the virus, and then followed by, ultimately by development of your own antibodies, which act to neutralize and clear the virus from the body. So again, it's largely a race between the immune system and the virus. Another important feature after post-exposure prophylaxis after a person has been potentially exposed to rabies is the risk assessment process. And this is something that's really critical and typically carried out either at an emergency department through local and state health departments, and they play a very important role in helping patients consider what their potential risk of rabies exposure is. And these are some basic concepts of just considering things like, was the animal domestic or wild? Was it owned? If it was owned, if that animal was vaccinated? What the local rabies reservoir and epidemiology is in the area. as far as what the actual risk is, and whether the bite was provoked or unprovoked. Did somebody try and grab the sandwich out of a dog's mouth? And these are all very important things to consider, because when we think about things, though, certainly we consider the mauled child to be a very serious physical trauma. The right picture in the right-hand corner is potentially the more deadly bite that's occurred. And this is also important from the perspective of trying to prevent administration of PEP to people with relatively low risk for the disease. It's important to remember that while rabies vaccine is certainly a safe vaccine and we don't see higher rates of adverse events than other vaccines out there, is that it's not water that's being injected in people, and there are potentials for adverse effects out there. In addition, rabies biologics tend to remain an extremely tenuous supply situation. Over the past several years, I think since 2005, and we have had 5, in fact, supply limitations or shortages in the United States. The most severe recently in 2008 and 2009, in which we had to actually withdraw pre-exposure vaccination for pre-exposure from the market, and post-exposure prophylaxis had to be carefully administered through state health departments to ensure that we would have vaccine available for people if an exposure occurred. So I want to move back out briefly to the sort of global perspective. Now, as mentioned earlier, rabies is not a rare disease. We have estimated to be more than tens of millions of exposures every year, and certainly more than 55,000 human deaths on an annual basis globally. And actually, recent burden estimates are suggesting this figure may be in the 65 to 70,000 range. The highest burden of the disease continues to be distributed across Africa and Asia. And there is a disproportionate burden amongst children, and I think that's really one of the key features from a global perspective of rabies, because the smaller stature in children are more likely to be playing or exposed to free-roaming dogs in these populations, that they tend to be the most likely to be exposed. And as I mentioned earlier, the sort of situation of a tenuous supply of vaccine in the United States, you can imagine what that is from a global perspective. And frequently, even where it is available, the cost of administering that vaccine far exceeds the incomes of the people who are most likely to be exposed. So the domestic dog, as I kind of suggested, is the single most important animal reservoir from a global perspective. It's still responsible for the majority of human deaths. Wildlife tends to be more of a concern in developed countries like the United States and Canada, but certainly wildlife can play an important part in developing countries, particularly throughout Latin America, where the vampire bat causes a significant number of human cases in rural areas of Amazonia and has an extensive economic impact in the cattle industry in that region. I really wanted to kind of highlight the issue of the importance of elimination of rabies in dogs. And you can see that there's a strong correlation wherever attempts to control canine rabies have undergone, and a strong correlation between the reduction in canine rabies cases and human rabies cases. And so the question has really become why we focus on the dog. As I suggested earlier, we know that more than 90% of exposures globally occur from dogs, and more than 99% of the deaths estimated occur from dogs. And in addition to the direct impact of rabies exposure and death from that, the increased risk of trauma and psychological trauma as well from severe attacks and exposure to these dogs. We do know that rabies control, as I suggested earlier, is possible with the elimination in dogs, but globally we face a challenge with the significant number of free-ranging street dogs in many of the developing countries. And unfortunately, in this case, the kind of model of bring your dog to the vet and have it vaccinated parenterally doesn't work that well. So there have been considerable efforts to actually develop novel strategies in these settings, including things like oral rabies vaccination and looking at utilization of other alternatives for contraception, and quite a bit of research into things like immunocontraception of free-roaming dogs. So I want to spend a little bit more time working through the perspective of rabies in the United States. And from a historical perspective, we know that rabies was most likely present in the United States before colonization. Reports in Alaska natives of rabies-like disease in Alaskan foxes, as well as conquistadors, which reported disease after attack by what appear to be vampire bats. But it really wasn't until post-colonization that we began to see the sort of modern historical record and increased cases, reports of rabies in foxes in the southeastern Canada region, as well as then the first reports of outbreaks in the dog populations in the Virginias at the time. And so this really kind of sets what we collectively think of as the classical image of dogs, the rabid dog running down the street, things like Old Yeller, To Kill a Mockingbird, Cujo, as people flee to their homes to prevent themselves from being attacked. And this was largely the picture throughout certainly the 18th century, 19th century, and moving into the early part of the 20th century. It was largely an urban and suburban crisis where dog populations and densities were sufficient for transmission. And in general, a high degree of anxiety and fear within the populations. And it wasn't really that until the late 1930s with the advance of more potent modern vaccines for dogs, and also correlated with the return of soldiers from overseas and a lot of public works type activities that were going on at the time. In the early 1940s rather, the first mass vaccination campaigns were trialed, first that actually occurred in Memphis, Tennessee. And this showed an immediate response in the reduction of canine rabies, and as I shown earlier, a significant decline in human rabies cases as well. These campaigns were continued to be carried out, and by the late 1970s, dog-to-dog rabies transmission and the canine rabies virus variant was eliminated in the United States. And so as this occurred, we began to see the changing face of rabies in the United States. We saw as the reduction in canine rabies occurred, more awareness of the presence and circulation of rabies virus variants in wildlife populations. And so when we look at it from the perspective today of rabies in the United States today, we're aware from longstanding antigenic typing of rabies virus variants that there are discrete geographic distributions of rabies associated with specific reservoirs, raccoons here in Georgia and along the East Coast, skunks throughout the central United States and California, and various variants in foxes in Alaska, Arizona, Texas, and mongoose in Puerto Rico. While there's no national surveillance for post-exposure prophylaxis or rabies exposure, we generally estimate actually that about 38 to 50,000 people receive post-exposure prophylaxis in a given year. Despite that, we still see between 1 to 8 cases of human rabies each year in the United States. And over the past history, approximately half of these are imported cases from people who have been exposed abroad. As I mentioned, again, stressing the issue of rabies is not rare. We have reported between 7,000 to 10,000 cases of animal rabies each year in the United States. While dog rabies transmission has been eliminated, but most of these still occur in these primary reservoir species, with raccoons really acting as a significant portion of those cases. And because of the broad distribution of bats overlaying these terrestrial reservoirs of rabies, with more than 12 different variants and multiple species, every state in the U.S. is considered enzootic for rabies, with the exception of Hawaii. If we look through a couple of projections, you can see how we arrive at these sort of geographic distributions of the rabies virus variants. In general, over the past several years, we've had around 2,000 cases of rabies reported in raccoons on an annual basis. And as I mentioned, raccoons really represent the highest burden of rabies in the United States, with in fact around 65 to 70% of the animal cases of rabies reported each year in the United States. So just beyond just the cases of rabies in raccoons, they tend to be higher populations in more suburban areas, higher contact rates with humans, and higher contact rates with other animals that results in a lot of cross-species transmission of this variant. Skunks, on the other hand, I think everyone knows just to try and avoid a skunk, so whether it's rabbit or not. When we look at bats, you can see that bats, again, are broadly distributed throughout the United States. The number of bats reported have increased dramatically over the past few years as there's been increased recognition, really going back to the early 90s, of the importance of bats involved in human exposure. And in fact, over the past 10 years, bats have accounted for about 80% of the domestically acquired human rabies cases. Looking at skunks have largely, though historically were a very large player in the cases of animal rabies reported each year in the United States. Their role has largely declined over the past several years. This is something that's a potential research interest right there. But in fact, even this decline has actually been somewhat overshadowed again, and the pure number of skunk rabies cases that are reported, again, now more than 50% of rabid skunks are actually due to the raccoon rabies virus variant. Foxes tend to be kind of our lowest reported cases of the reservoir species. And in fact, most of these cases, again, are due to the raccoon rabies virus variant. And we do the geographic distribution of the circulation of rabies due to fox variants in Arizona and Texas. We tend to see fewer numbers of these animals reported, largely because they overlap with very sparse human population areas. And so there's a lower overall reporting density from these areas. And I should indicate that there's an extensive effort at rabies surveillance. Though it's a passive system, it still relies primarily on a potential contact between an animal and a human. But that ultimately still results on a national basis in more than 120,000 animals submitted and tested by local laboratories each year. So really an extensive effort carried out by public health laboratories. So beyond the concept of the antigenic typing that's gone on for years to define the geographic areas, there's been a lot of efforts over the past 10 years to identify the phylogenetic association of these rabies virus variants. And one of the interesting things that we've ultimately found is that over the course of the years in the process of canine rabies being introduced to the United States and the elimination of canine rabies, there were actually multiple host shifts of the canine rabies virus variant into wildlife that now sustain these. So in fact, these sort of canine lineage viruses consisting of the north central skunk variant up here in the Dakotas area, California, and both of the fox rabies virus variants were actually due to some kind of host shift from the canine rabies virus variant that was originally in the United States and now are being maintained in these species. This is in contrast to the raccoon rabies virus variant and the south central skunk rabies virus variant that were actually due to some form of host shift at some point in time in the past from bat rabies virus variants. And so this certainly raises a particular concern from the perspective of controlling and managing wildlife rabies in the United States if these host shift events can occur. And certainly there's some suggestion that they may occur on a somewhat more frequent basis than we've considered historically. So I've kind of spoken around the concept of control of rabies and wildlife populations. And so oral rabies vaccination began in the United States after repeated attempts to try and control the animal populations in which rabies circulated. Historically, and in many countries, this was largely carried out through strychnine baiting of the animal populations to try and reduce them to a level in which rabies wouldn't circulate. And we know that this is not a successful attempt. It's not a recommended procedure anymore. And so really beginning in, I should point out there were some early attempts at some alternatives. This is my favorite, Trapovac, which the fox stamps on and gets skewered by a rabies vaccine. But moving beyond that, oral rabies vaccination was really developed by Dr. George Baer, a former director of the rabies program at CDC in the late 1960s. And while the early stages of this attenuated oral rabies vaccine were not used in the US due to concerns about reversion to a pathogenic strain, it was moved on very quickly by the Europeans, who used it extensively throughout Western and Central Europe, and ultimately resulted in the elimination of rabies in red foxes throughout most of Europe today. It wasn't until moving a little bit later on in the development of a chimeric virus using the vaccinia and the rabies glycoprotein expression in the vaccinia virus, that oral rabies vaccination really began in the United States. And now, in general, you can see that that's extensively carried out. More than 42 million vaccines are distributed across the US, Canada, and Europe on an annual basis. And while from a cost perspective, it's certainly somewhat prohibitive. These vaccines are much more expensive than, say, a parenteral vaccination you would use for your dog or cat. It has been successful and has led to the elimination of specific rabies virus variants, both in Europe and the United States, on a large landscape scale. And in fact, one of the first places where the vaccinia rabies glycoprotein, VRG vaccine was used was actually in Texas. The vaccine was being developed for raccoons, but there was a reemergence of the canine rabies virus variant just about 10 years after we had eliminated it in coyotes in southern Texas, and several human cases that were associated with this virus. And so the vaccine was kind of co-opted for the program there and distributed on a large basis throughout the southern section of Texas, and ultimately resulted in the elimination of this variant. It was also expanded to the Texas gray fox variant, which is very close to being eliminated as well. As I mentioned, the primary intent around the VRG vaccine was development for controlling rabies in raccoon populations. And this was specifically a concern because beginning in the 1970s, raccoon rabies was really only distributed to the southeastern United States, Florida, Georgia, Alabama. And it wasn't until that time period when a group of hunters came down to Florida and they decided that their raccoon supply was short up in the Virginias and carried a few animals back with them. And this led to one of the larger epizootics in recorded history in the United States, which rapidly spread throughout the mid-Atlantic and the northeastern United States. And it caused quite a bit of concern. As I mentioned earlier, raccoons have a much greater density and there are much higher levels of cross-species transmission of the rabies virus variant. So after Texas got started, there was then efforts that began in the late 1990s for ORV, and really by 2001, what we have, kind of the modern perspective that we have of oral rabies vaccination for raccoons in the United States, with barrier moving from Lake Erie through the Appalachians and with some breaks all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. And this is a large-scale effort involving tens of millions of baits distributed by plane, by helicopter, by hand, any way that it can be distributed, and primarily from the perspective of preventing the raccoon rabies virus variant from progressing further westward and saving these states from the additional burden of the virus if it were to spread. I think this is largely an effort led by USDA. There have been recent development of new vaccines that are suggestive of being more immunogenic and in combination with VRG that we are now potentially looking at, or USDA rather, is looking at trying to move forward with perspectives and plans for the elimination of raccoon rabies virus variant at this point in time. So I just want to wrap up in closing. We certainly have had many successes for rabies in the United States. We've eliminated canine rabies. We've eliminated wildlife rabies virus variants. We've stopped rabies virus variants in their path. But we can't sleep. We can't stop looking at it. There are many threats that still face us from that perspective. We continue along the lines of ORV with raccoons, have to monitor with enhanced surveillance to ensure that these animals are not moving west of that barrier and potentially making that entire effort for naught. In the same perspective, while canine rabies virus variant has been eliminated, we continue to be challenged with well-meaning citizens picking up the puppy in a foreign country and bringing it back to the United States. And in fact, there have been multiple occasions of reintroduction of canine rabies virus variant by travelers. In addition, we face climatic impacts. Due to issues related to climate change, there have been red foxes moving higher into greater territory and contact with Arctic foxes. And there's been suggestions of increased transmission of the Arctic fox rabies virus variant to red foxes, and potential concerns from that point of progression and movement of that variant to the larger distribution of red foxes back into Canada and the United States. And from the same perspective, we continue to be vigilant from the south. As climate change has moved, there are suggestions that vampire bats may potentially be able to move into the United States within the next 40 to 50 years, and potential issues not only from contact and rabies exposure, but impacts that this may have on the cattle industry in the United States. And again, we continue to monitor issues of those potential host shift events, primarily from bats into local wildlife species in areas that had not had a burden of terrestrial rabies before. And on record, we've had a well-documented case of this, multiple incursions in Flagstaff, Arizona, and populations of skunks and foxes there. And more recently of concern, clusters of disease in Oregon with a large cluster of bat-related rabies virus variants in foxes. And so this kind of keeps us up at night. So I'll just conclude on that. My mentor, Dr. Charles Ruprecht, the chief of the rabies program that just left, certainly one of his favorite sayings is that we have miles to go before we sleep, and I think that's the best way to sum up rabies. Thank you very much.
I think we have time for one question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
The new variant that was found in the Grand Canyon, that is supposed to be able to spread without a bite?
That was poor journalism.
Okay.
There's no suggestion that variant is any different from other rabies virus variants.
Because it's spread, they said it's between like bat, skunk, and fox?
Yeah, the studies that we looked at currently suggest that there were actually multiple incursions of a bat rabies virus variants into the skunk populations and then raccoons. And there are suggestions that there were changes in the virus that allowed it to circulate amongst those species. But the standard transmission dynamics, bite to bite to bite, nothing that it's more pathogenic or infectious. Along those lines.
One more question? No more? Okay. Thank you, Jessica.